This is working. All right. So I kind of threw myself into the mix as sort of a last-minute entry. I hope that's okay. And I decided I was going to talk a little bit on Caritas, right? Caritas as love, right? Charitable love. And the topic of the talk is Caritas, a gift and a choice. And I learned a lot just by, sort of delving into what some of the remarks that I wanted to make were. Because I'm a last minute entry, I'm going to be a little page dependent, but I'll try not to just read it verbatim on you. The one thing I am going to read verbatim is a scripture, okay? I want to get that right? So I'm going to read a scripture, a couple of verses for you that should be super familiar to you, okay? It's from 1 Corinthians, and it says, "If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. For now we see only in a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I'm fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." So the first thing I did, because this is how I function, is I plugged in Caritas and I looked up definitions, right? So it means love in Latin, all right? But it also comes, and I found this very interesting, it comes from the same root as a word that means high price, costliness, and dearness. And all of a sudden, it made me realize that, yeah, it is more difficult than at first glance, right? It's pretty costly to love as we're being asked to love. But then I started to think, but why is it so hard for us human beings? Why is that such a hard thing to do? And I think there are lots of obstacles. And here's where some of what Kay said kind of, dovetails a little bit. An obstacle could be fear, right? We're trying to distance ourselves or trying to protect ourselves. It could be fatigue. It just takes too much effort. Or I am who I am, right? I don't want to change. I don't want to have to do anything that's more difficult. It can be due to our own pride. What will it look like to others? How will others see me? It can be to preconceived notions or assessments of the other, right? The lens through which we're looking through. And there are probably a bazillion other reasons in theology and in psychology that we could actually point to that makes this so difficult. I'm just going to take a look at that preconceived notions and assessments part. Okay, so the lens. What lens are we looking through? Or maybe another way, whose eyes are we using when we look at or interact with another person? What are some of the very human tendencies that cause us to see another person differently than God might see them? So I happened across this very simple study that was done by Scientific American, where they tried to determine, okay, what are the two things that human beings first assess when they meet somebody else? And they boiled it down to two. One was the warmth of the individual, and one was the competence of the individual. But what was really interesting about it is they would show these photos, and sometimes of the same person with a little different look on their face, and people would say, oh, that's a warm person, or oh, that's a competent person. But inevitably, the competent person looked much more serious. So it was like these things might overlap, but in that first minute evaluation of the other person, those were two different things, even though they weren't extremes of the same thing, right? Someone was either warm and nice, but maybe not competent, or someone was very competent, but probably a little standoffish, right? Now, do we believe that? Do we think that we fall into those two categories? Well, I would say some of our cliches might say yes, like the cliche of the dumb blonde, right? Or women versus men, right? Cliche. Women versus men applying for the same job. We still have some of these preconceived notions. Or someone's attractive or someone's nerdy. Can a nerdy person actually be attractive? Yeah, I think so, right? Okay. We also judge and see people through the lens of our own beliefs, right? Our own beliefs about them, or perhaps even what someone has told us about them, right? Right? So if I say this person right here is a little cold, but once you get to know him, he's actually a good person, then if you had never met him, then when you meet him, I can guarantee you're going to say, I wonder what Lila saw that made her think he's cold. Oh, yeah, there it is. Oh, yeah, there it is, right? But let me dig down a little bit because supposedly he's kind of a good person under there, right? But all of a sudden you're looking through my lens, right? You're not experiencing that person from your own encounter. You're looking through my eyes. You're looking through my lens on that. And it might color your experience of that person. So what lens do we use when we see someone who's maybe elderly or frail, right? I've caught myself doing this once in a while too. And this isn't so much a personal example, but one that's probably come up, and that is, she is 80 years old, but she's really smart. What is the but in there, right? Like an 80-year-old can't be smart because we're seeing them as elderly and frail. We're also seeing them as dementia, right? You know, even if that's not the case with this person. What's the lens if we see someone who dresses totally different? What's our lens when we see someone or hear someone who speaks differently? How does our lens impact us when we see someone who has, at the present time or in the past history, had a history of drug abuse or homelessness or criminal or jail time? Do we start looking at them through a different lens because of history or because of present, as opposed to seeing them for who they really are, this person that's in front of me? How about this? How is our present experience of someone colored by our past experience of someone, right? Well, this happened in the past. It doesn't matter if it was a bad day, right? Okay, but it's going to color my, and maybe that's where fear and pride comes in, right? I want to distance myself. I want to protect myself. Again, it comes back to the lens. Whose eyes are we peering through? So I can hear the argument, and it's a valid one. Lila, I only have my own eyes, right? I only have my own experience. I'm filtering everything through my experience and my eyes. Whose eyes do you want me to look through? Okay, all right, hold on to that thought. I'm gonna look like I'm taking a turn, but I'm coming back to it. So Caritas, or love, is a theological virtue. Faith, hope, love, right? As such, it's an infused gift from God that only reaches perfection in God who is love. Okay. I'm going to read a quote. Many times when charity is mentioned in the English language, it refers to love of God, which is a spiritual love or theological virtue that is extended from God to man and then reflected by man, who is in the image of God, back to God. Okay. We can go on to say, one example of this movement could be the practice of charity brings us to act towards ourselves and others out of love alone, precisely because each person has the dignity of the beloved child of God. Let's boil it down a little bit. So for Catherine of Siena, love of God is where our virtues begin. Love of God is where the virtue begins. In our love of neighbor, that's when that virtue comes alive. Because this love comes from God, it must be without constraint, right? God had no constraint in infusing that love in you. We're to have no constraint when we pass that love on in action and habit to our neighbor. Aquinas nails it down a little further, thank goodness. He says that caritas, love, is an infused theological virtue that resides in the will. Got blown out of the water when I read that. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's where the title comes from. It's also a decision to act, right? It resides in the will. So while it is a gift given by God, infused into our being, it is at the disposal of our will. We choose how to respond, when to love, and when to act lovingly. I'm going to put something in here that my 25-year-old daughter said. She said, you know, when someone's a good person, we like to think that goodness is just going to be the natural thing that comes from being a good person. But whether you're a good person or a bad person, you still have to choose to do good. That's from a 25-year-old. And I'm like, I think St. Thomas would say, yep. I think he would agree with her. According to St. Thomas, charity or caritas resides in the will because the object of love is the good, willing the good of the other. And the highest good is God's goodness. The will is at the root of all activity. So charity can direct love and integrate its activity towards God. He also holds that the habit of charity, the habit of love, extends to love of neighbor, and that a charitable attitude towards others is a secondary manifestation of this virtue. He pretty much just said what my 25-year-old said, but with bigger words in a whole paragraph, right? But the same thing. So let's go back to what are the human obstacles for making this love a reality in our lives and interactions with others? Our lens, our eyes, and our will. While the lens is understandable, human, they can all become default settings for us, automatic responses in our brains and our emotions and our memories. And while that's understandable, Jesus asks us to step up our game. An example would be the calling of Matthew the tax collector. Through the lens of love, he was seen, and the promise of what he could become was at the root of his being called. The woman at the well, why would you speak to me, a Samaritan? He didn't call her out by calling out the fact that she'd been married many times. Hopefully you remember this story, right? But instead, he called the truth out of her. He said, go tell your husband. He didn't say, you know, you've got 5 husbands, or you've had 5 husbands. He said, go call your husband. And she's the one that came through with the truth. He called the truth out of her instead of smacking her in the head with the truth, okay? Catherine of Siena was good at this in her dealings with popes and others. In contemporary times, we have St. Teresa of Calcutta, who saw Jesus in the face of the poor, the miserable, and perhaps even the repulsive, right? So when she first started, I'm imagining that when she started working with the poor, and some of them just in terrible medical condition and literally repulsive, you know, worms and everything else, I'm betting she flinched the first time, right? That would be the human response. I'm betting she flinched the first time. But she kept choosing to use the lens of Jesus's eyes, and she kept choosing to pour out that love that Jesus had poured into her. And then when that became her natural habit, because she communed with Christ every day, now it became a natural thing for her to do. But I'm betting she flinched the first time. We're going to flinch. We're going to flinch. We still have to take a step back, recognize whose eyes we're supposed to be using, and choose. That's the choice part of Caritas, right? It's a big ask, but it is exactly what the Lord is asking. Draw close to him and become more and more aware of Caritas. You've been given this gift. Choose to put it at the service and into the lives of your neighbor. Do this when you need to act kindly towards yourself. Do this when you need to act kindly within your families. Do this when you have to act kindly within this community. And by all means, take it to the world, because our world so desperately is in need of Caritas. Thank you.